The Proto-Renaissance is our last discussion in the course, and this will help to conclude Art History 1 for you, but also to help you transition to Art History 2 if you're going on to that class. Proto means something coming into being, right? Something being created. So this is before the Renaissance. We're seeing some of what the Renaissance will be emerge, but it's not quite the Renaissance yet, right? So we're getting there, but not quite. And the Renaissance is really the rebirth of the classical world. Renaissance is from the French verb naître, to birth, and it is a rebirth, right? Renaissance, right? To birth again. So this is going to be the rebirth of classicism, right? The Greco-Roman world, essentially. And you have to think about, what have we left behind? We've left behind imagery like you find in the early medieval, right? Where you don't see a lot of realism. You see these stocky bodies, right? A lot of stylization, right? A lot of use of pattern. And what are we looking for, right? The artists of the Proto-Renaissance are looking back to the Greco-Roman world. So they're looking back to the world of Greece and Rome, and they're looking at these art pieces. Notice the contrapposto using the Aphrodite of Knidos, right? So they're looking for more realism, more use of these kind of classical values, right, for inspiration in their arts. And we also have to think about, what's the difference going to be between the medieval world and the Renaissance world? I had really stressed to you that the medieval world was a very collective, mystical, church-centered world, right? It's a world that's about the what are we doing, not the what am I doing. And the Renaissance is going to be about the I, right? It's going to be about what the individual can create. It's going to be much more about, again, that kind of humanistic worldview that we saw back when we were talking about Greek art. We're also going to see a lot of powerful families, right, coming to play in the Renaissance. And we'll talk in the Proto-Renaissance about, the power of the city-state, right, the power of these various city-states to make an impact. This map of Renaissance Italy shows you how many city-states were really sort of existent, right, at the time of the Renaissance, right? Italy wasn't a unified whole, right? It was really operating through this, city-state system, and that will definitely come to bear in how art is going to be created, right? And we'll talk a little bit more about the city-states of Florence, and also the city-state of Siena as well. And so you see them there in the middle. Florence is a green area, right? Siena, a little purple area. And of course, to the right of those two, you see the papal states, right? The state of the church, right? Where Rome is located. And that's going to be the heart of the church, right? The papal states. Now, this is a nice little sort of blow up, right, of that same map. So again, you can see the Republic of Florence, right? The Republic of Siena, and then the states of the church as well. So again, you had these city-states sort of functioning, right, to sort of organize, right, society, right, and organize the kind of products that are going to be produced. I wanted to mention, a bit about how style is going to progress, how style is going to change. We're leaving the medieval, we're leaving that sort of stylized look, and then what can we see, right, changing, right, as we move forward? We talked about, looking at the Reims Cathedral portal sculpture, right, or looking at the Virgin of Paris, right, to see some of these early hints of change. And if you look at this piece by Martini, the Annunciation, which again, the Annunciation is the angel coming to Mary to say, you will bear God. If we look at this piece, this was actually called International Gothic style. And so I would show you this one to show you a blend of the past, right? Sort of this idea of the Gothic look, right? And then some of the advancements, right, into the Proto Renaissance. So if you think about the arches, right, the sort of architectural setting of the piece, right, that's very Gothic looking. But then if you look at the figures, right, they look more weighty, they look more substantial. So that looks more Proto-Renaissance, right? So we can think about how this is kind of a mix of the past, right, and the future. And another of Martini's works, right, that you could find in the Palazzo Pubblico or the public house in Siena, in the council chambers there, where we're seeing more realistic use of space, but we still see these weird Gothic elements like, again, the sort of arched throne, right? And the sort of hanging coverings in the background. So again, there are little baby steps that you can witness if you look at these artists and sort of think about the progression through the Proto-Renaissance of style. The next artist we look at is Cimabue. And again, you start to see a little bit more move towards realism, but still some heavily Gothic type of elements, right, in these works. If you're like, I'm seeing a lot of Madonnas and Childs, right? The Madonna and Child imagery is very prominent in the Proto-Renaissance. It's kind of like the staple subject matter, right, of the time. So you would not be wrong there. So again, we can look at Cimabue and think a little bit about how he's progressing as well. And then you go to Duccio, and you see another giant kind of leap forward. They're all playing with almost the same subject, but as each iteration, each new artist in the lineage is figuring out more realistic ways to show you, right, this subject matter. In this Duccio, for instance, the portrayal of Jesus, I always point to something simple like the trees in the background and that rock escarpment, that piece of rock in the background, which creates, in a sense, a foreground, a middle ground, and a background where it's not just a flat 2D piece anymore. You almost have a sense of recession of space and recession into the background. However, then it's kind of ruined by that like kind of weird gold background, right? So again, baby steps, right? All the time. And then we get to someone like Giotto. And Giotto is really praised in the Proto-Renaissance as sort of the transition point, right? A transition artist to Renaissance kind of style, right? And he actually was trained by Cimabue, so I'll show you their pieces side by side here in a minute. But you'll notice same subject, but with Giotto, right, there's this sense of realism that we haven't really seen before. So Giotto is really celebrated as taking what his master Cimabue gave him and finding a way to make it even more realistic. Um, Probably the most famous piece he's known for is the Arena Chapel, or what's called the Scrovegni Chapel. You can go by either name, right? Some people call it the Arena Chapel. It was located near an arena in Padua, where it's located, but it was commissioned by the Scrovegni family. So we also can call it the Scrovegni Chapel. And I gave you a couple different things here on the slide. First, a quote by Boccaccio, who was a writer during this time and into the Renaissance. And he said that Giotto, there's nothing in the whole creation that he cannot depict. So when he's speaking about Giotto's works, he's like, this is the first time we're really looking at, someone who knows how to make something look real. The So again, he was very praised even during his own time. And the chapel was meant to show you a couple different storylines, or what we call cycles. You have the cycle of the life of Joaquin and Anne, the parents of Mary. Then you have the life of Mary, then the life of Christ, and then the passion of Christ. And they run through the spaces, right, of the chapel, so you can kind of follow along the cycle or the storyline. The chapel itself was commissioned by the Scrovegnis to address what we call the sin of usury. The Scrovegni family were money lenders, which was a very typical profession in the Proto-Renaissance and Renaissance time periods, where you made your money by lending other people money, and often at very exorbitant interest rates. And so in this image that Giotto painted in the chapel, you'll notice that as the Scrovegni family members presenting the chapel to the three Marys, almost like they're saying, yes, we've sinned, we've made a lot of money off of other people through predatory lending, but here we made you this beautiful chapel. If you know anything about the Catholic Church in the Renaissance period, they actually will start to sell what's called indulgences or forgiveness for sins. So we see this beginning here with the idea of like, you can buy off your sin of usury by commissioning a beautiful chapel. So, that's something to consider, thinking about a difference of mentality between the medieval and the Renaissance, where in the medieval everything was a very collective, notion. Everything was collective project. Here you have a singular family who's trying to buy themselves into heaven, essentially, right? This is all about them. It's all about the individualism of them, right? So, a very different attitude than how the church would be dealt with in the medieval. Now, you look at Giotto's imagery in the Arena Chapel, and you can even see his progression here. For instance, the first cycle, right, the Joaquin and Anne cycle, you'll notice it's still a little clunky. It's still a little stylized. It's not quite right. Like, where the heck is that angel coming from? Like, where's the rest of its body? It looks like a dollhouse. The proportions look all out of whack, right? But then you move on to the Mary cycle. Here's a visitation of Elizabeth and Mary. And we're like, okay, we're seeing some progress here. Giotto has definitely jumped from kind of a more medieval representation to a more proto-Renaissance representation. He's learning, he's figuring it out. And then by the time you get to the birth of Christ, the Christ cycle, and then the Passion of Christ cycle, the Lamentation, you really see that Giotto is learning a lot of lessons here. These bodies look real, they look weighty, they have mass, they operate like real people would in space. You have things like foreshortening being introduced. Something like the rock face, again, creates a sense of foreground, middle ground, background. So we're really seeing some progression towards what the Renaissance will expect. Some technique, right? Some realism, and so he's able to achieve those things. The final thing I wanted to mention is that you really can't discount the role of the city state, right? And why these proto Renaissance and later Renaissance artists will create their work. They're often receiving commissions from these city states, right? As well as these wealthy families. And so a lot of the work you see, I would say, is kind of the work about the city or the civic environment. They're trying to praise where they're from. And so here you are in the Palazzo Pubblico, in the public square in Siena, which is surrounded by all these government buildings. And artists would be brought in, right, to create these large scale pieces, right, for these structures. So I'm showing you some murals done by the Lorenzetti brothers. And here you're seeing Ambrogio Lorenzetti's allegory of the effects of good government. There also, of course, will be an allegory of the effects of bad government as well. And you'll notice that he's created these kind of murals that go across, right, the interior of the space. So when people are in their meeting talking about taxes or talking about public works, they can look up and see these images that are supposed to guide them to think about the good of their community, right? The good of their people, essentially, inform their decision making process, and have them care a bit about the civic mindedness that they're supposed to be embracing, right? To understand what the people of the city need, what the people of the country need, and how to avoid, not being good rulers, right? How do you avoid becoming a dictator, right? Becoming something bad, right? So again, I think it's important to consider the role of the city state and government, right, in commissioning some works. And again, this will be a very real thing, right, in the Renaissance as well.